Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and I've got plans to check in on my European nightcrawler worm bins. One of them is right here behind me. It's the oldest of my worm bins at the present time. And the other European nightcrawler bin that we want to check in on is down on the floor. It's actually my youngest worm bin right now. And besides that, I've also got a system that I refer to as a cocoon nursery. It's the one all the way at the right over there with the white covering on it. That's also on my list of things to do. I took down a couple little bits of information about each of these systems to show here briefly to explain what the game plan is. So I've got, like I said, the oldest of my bins up on the shelf over there. It's the last one here. It's actually 182 days at this point. And I kind of broke down its component numbers as far as that age goes, just to show that for 140 days of that time, 20 weeks, it was composting, and then over the past 42 days, the past 6 weeks, it's been doing what I refer to as foraging. No fresh food, just let them focus on breaking down the residual scraps in there. And there's the decision point at some point to decide, is that done? Can we proceed to trying to migrate the worms out of the system? That's going to be one of the things we're going to try to determine today. And then on the other two bins, there's the simple matter of just feeding that newest of my bins, which it's not even received any food so far. So I'll be curious to see how things are looking in there after a week. And then the cocoon nursery is really just the material that those worms occupying the new bin used to live in. After it got evacuated, I held on to the material with the assumption that there were a whole bunch of cocoons left behind in that material. So I'm kind of nurturing those cocoons to see if we can possibly end up with some additional babies to reintroduce into the original colony. So I'm going to put a glove on and we're going to get to work. So it just occurred to me that 20 weeks and 6 weeks, 20 weeks of composting, 6 weeks of foraging is 26 weeks, which is 182 days as we saw earlier, but that's also precisely 1/2 of a year. So this bin is now at the 6-month mark. And the other, I guess, novel thing about the 182 days is that past few bins of mine have all somehow coincidentally ran through the 3 phases and were drawn to an end in 182 days at various different breakdowns. Some of them composted longer and shorter, some of them foraged longer, shorter, whatever. So it wasn't 3 bins or so finishing at 182 days where the foraging and the migration, all of them happened. But somehow, even with all those various processes taking various amounts of times in each of the different systems, it did somehow work out that I've recently managed to complete a number of bins in 182 days, but this is not going to be one of them. Because technically we're still foraging and we haven't really made the decision to stop, but we could very well make that decision today. This really dark worm here somehow just doesn't appear as if it belongs. The rest of these kind of have that European nightcrawler appearance, but this guy somehow looks different. I don't know. Could it be an African nightcrawler that snuck in here? I don't know. Things are a little bit, uncertain from that point of view in my bins occasionally. Just because the bins are sort of stacked up one on top of each other on my shelving systems. If a worm, escapes from an upper bin, it could very easily drop down into a lower bin. So sometimes I wonder if I've just got a big mishmash of worm populations in all my systems. I guess the one really nice thing I observed here from the very start when we opened up this corner was the nice damp feel of the material, as well as a good number of worms populating the material. And it's always those far reaches of the bin out near the edges where things could potentially dry out a little bit. You could see even here a little bit of the airflow that sneaks around the bin results in more dry material, but luckily that's only happening right on the very, very surface. And then I go down just a couple inches and I'm already bumping into numerous worms right there, very close to the surface. almost even just kind of daring themselves to go play in that dry material. So it doesn't seem to be putting them off by much. Sometimes it's these things. It's all these leaf stems that I kind of treat as my gauge for calling it quits in a foraging bin and saying, you know what, foraging looks like it's achieved its goal. It's broken down all of the residual bits of food and bedding that still reside within the system. So I think just from my initial glance, to see this many sticks and stems makes me think that they probably could just go for a little bit longer. So I think I might have even predicted last time we checked in here that it could go, 50 days or more. Who knows? I suppose it's possible, but it would be kind of nice if maybe we were to check in here in another week's time or so and come to the realization that a lot of this stuff like this has really gotten to the stage where we could kind of start focusing the attention of the worms on moving out of the material as opposed to trying to break the material down any further. But for now, I think the primary focus should be for them to continue their work on this material. So that's good. I just needed to know how much food to bring down from the freezer. Was it going to be just the food I need to feed my 7-day-old new bin, or would it be the portion required to feed them, plus also set up a migration feeding zone in this bin to get the movement of the worms going, to try to round them up and relocate them. So I'm really satisfied with the appearance of these castings. Everything just has this nice damp feel to it. However, nothing seems muddy or sticky or gooey or anything. Everything just flows and crumbles readily. Let me just take a quick peek on this edge before we close up the box and let it continue as is. Right down to the coverings, everything I believe is pretty much ideal. The only thing I kind of toyed with there for a moment, you might have saw me kind of grab a few handfuls of these little chunks of paper, bedding, whatever. I had placed it out on the surface there briefly, thinking to myself that, hey, maybe I can even kind of help this bin get to that more mature, finalized stage by plucking out some of these things that are, distracting the worms from focusing on all the small, tiny stuff. If there's a big mango seed in the box, some worms are obviously focusing on that rather than all the other stuff. But, in the long run, I don't think it really makes that big of a difference for them to still have a little treat like this in here. So I'll give it back to them. I'll let them continue on that. But I could see possibly in a future visit pulling out any large chunk object that I can find, and maybe just setting it aside briefly and giving it to the newer bin where there'll be plenty of time for that stuff to break down. So all right, I can see a few worms starting to crawl the walls here. I guess they're not appreciating my friendly little visit. So why don't we get this thing buttoned up again and let it continue. But I must say the material is looking really nice and it feels perfect. One thing I do sometimes in my my bins like this, where I'm not coming in to feed, sometimes I'll just try to determine if the moisture level might seem a little bit lacking, and if it does, then I'll apply a little bit of water. It's that time of year when the furnace is kicking on now, and my furnace really sucks the moisture out of the air as it's heating it, and as a result, I do notice the air sucking a lot of moisture out of my worm systems, which I've been diligently trying to compensate for. But luckily that's not the case here. Somehow it seems to me like we're in an ideal situation here, and I don't think we're very far from the point where we might be able to bless this system as truly done and, ready for migration. But let's move on to the next system. Now here, within the cocoon nursery, there's not much to do other than to pretty much validate that things are on track. My assumption is that they are, but it's always wise to, once in a while at least, check in to make sure nothing has gone haywire. So I try to just, you know, tend to the needs of the cocoon nursery at the same time as when I'm tending to the primary population that created the cocoons that are in the material. And at some point maybe I was even thinking of just sort of grouping all my cocoon nursery check-ins to a single point in time, sort of group the nursery bins together versus, you know, keeping them attached logically to the system that the cocoons were left behind by. But I don't know, right now this just seems like the logical way to handle it. I definitely like the moisture that I'm seeing down here, and I doubt that the camera's picking up on it, but I can certainly see cocoons all laid out here all along this sloped edge. It's so cool. And I wonder if it could just be because of the moisture that was collecting on that bubble wrap we removed, kind of creating this recirculative kind of humid zone right over here, you know. But it's probably the same story up here. I don't know, this just does somehow feel a lot more damp. But, you know, I guess since we're still seeing a good number of cocoons here, and some of them are very dark in color, which suggests that they're, you know, nearing that point in time when they should start producing a baby worm. But other ones appear to be a little bit more light in color, like this one here. So let me see if I can just let my clean hand get a little bit soiled here. I think that was a cocoon that may have already, you know, produced its offspring. All right, I thought I saw a whole bunch of, but you know what? I ran through here a moment ago and I sort of pressed down the material when I was sort of checking it for moisture, and I may have kind of inadvertently buried a bunch of cocoons that were just really obvious right there on the surface. So a couple of them are very clearly darker in color. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but these two closer to me are the dark ones. This one further away is a little bit lighter, suggesting that it was deposited into the material later in the game. As they near that point in time when they're going to hatch, they get darker and darker in color. So, you know, first impression, just from looking at this stuff, it looks pretty darn good. Either way, I'm definitely seeing lots of good signs here as far as cocoons out on the surface. Sometimes I look through one of these systems and I hardly see any. But I believe that there was something about this system where it just seemed like there were lots and lots of cocoons, possibly more than what I'm used to. So they really do seem to be standing out. And I don't know, maybe I'm just sort of zeroing in on them somehow for some reason now. But they really do seem to stand out quite easily. But before we close up this box, I guess we'll have to just sort of stop fawning over all the cocoons. I want to just sort of get a gauge as to that one right there. It looks like a little pearl. There's so many of them. I don't know how the camera's doing as far as picking up on them, but I'm definitely seeing quite a good number of cocoons all over the place. This does almost make me feel like we might be a little bit sort of suboptimal as far as a nice damp environment for the cocoons to be able to emerge in. This one just looks much bigger than all the other ones I had in my hand before. Man, this material is so nice. And you can see this is kind of what you end up with. A lot of these leaf stems are not the full-length leaf stem. They're deteriorated to the point where they're cracking in half and stuff. But they're not quite gone yet. But they'll get there. And the reason I don't worry too much about leaving scraps like that behind in my finished compost is because I'm gonna, in most cases, do exactly what we're seeing here, which is run a cocoon nursery. And you know, I want to try to set the stage for a nice, pleasant environment into which these babies can be born. And that includes nice dampness, nice supply of food and bedding type materials within the system. And that's why I don't mind having all kinds of little scraps of leftover this and that, because that'll just be consumed by the babies once they start emerging from their cocoons. All right, I do feel like we're going to have to apply a little bit of moisture to this, so let's get that taken care of, and then this will be a done deal here too. The larger worms that I sort of picked out of the material here and there as we were inspecting, those are worms that just probably got left behind when I did the separation of the adult worms and moved them over into their new home. It's kind of an imperfect process, you know. There's always going to be a few stragglers that aren't paying attention, and they'll be left behind. And their job will be to welcome the babies into the world once they start to emerge. But they'll get rounded up with the rest of them. They'll get rounded up with the babies once we get around to that point in time. So yeah, I don't think a lot of moisture is needed, but I do feel like I'd like to apply at least a little bit. So let me get my bottle. Okay, let's get this over with. Alright, so I don't think I really anticipated putting quite so much moisture in, but it felt right. It really felt like the right thing to do. I've always really been kind of averse to the idea of even doing that, as far as like having a nice batch of really flaky, beautiful castings like this that do have some nice moisture content to them, and then going ahead and adding water to it, you know. To me that just seemed so counterintuitive. To me it always seemed like, you know, hey, you're going to spoil the castings, you're going to make them all muddy and nasty. But the castings do have just this really incredible ability to draw the moisture into themselves, even kind of share that moisture around with the neighboring material. And unless the stuff's already kind of damp and nasty anyway to begin with, you won't really end up with muddy stuff. You'll just end up with stuff that's a little bit more hydrated and a little bit more friendly for the inhabitants of the system. So I really like the way this is progressing. After 7 days, you wouldn't expect much progress on baby worms emerging yet, but you know, anything we could do like this to pave the way for that to happen soon is a good thing. So let's go get the last bin out here, figure out how our newest worm bin is doing. Alright, so before fetching the bin that we're going to feed, I thought I would really quickly just show what I grabbed from the fridge. This is some mashed potato. I know it probably has some butter, some salt, some no-no type stuff in there that the worms might struggle with for a little while, but I got a feeling that that sort of stuff will just dissipate over time. Perhaps the other helper creatures in the bin will set the stage for that stuff getting eventually eaten up by the worms too. Here we've got a coffee. And this was really what I had hoped to use today, to not only feed my newest bin, but also to set the feeding zone in my oldest bin to get the migration started. But I think we're only going to use about half of this since we're not starting the migration. The foraging continues. So a portion of this will end up going back into the freezer once we're finished here, but we'll see how much of it we could fit. So let's get them out here and get them fed. Besides the foods that they're going to get, I've also got some bedding to go with the food, as well as a little bit of grit to complement the food. So those are the sort of ancillary feeding item components we're going to use as well today. So let's open up the box and see how these worms have acclimated to their new home. Hopefully they're all doing well. There's a good bit of moisture that's trying to escape the bin, but not being able to. Getting caught by that plastic and dropping back down onto this piece of paper bag. A lot of times worms do come up to take advantage of these little puddles, and you see some castings here and there, but not a lot of traffic, or at least no signs of much traffic yet. And then we're down into the bin, and a lot of these pieces of cardboard were materials that made up their previous setup. These are actually the little dividing walls that I had set up in between the finished castings that the worms used to occupy and the feeding zone that I used to attract them so that I could round them all up. Here's a coffee filter that seems to be in pretty decent shape. But since it's been in the bin now for a week, or longer. I'm assuming it's been in the bin for about a week. I think it too can probably get utilized as bedding. It's making me wonder if we're going to have to use much of my prepared aged bedding, or maybe we can just make use of a lot of this stuff that's already in here, or maybe just a little combination of both. So this bin, when it was built for the worms, did not include any food. On occasion, when I build a new bin for worms, sometimes I implant a certain little bit of food into the system for the worms. In this case I did not, so there was only bedding used to build this new environment for them. So they've had a week to sort of check it all out and make themselves at home, but I don't expect to have any one particular location within the bin where we would expect to find a large number of worms, because the material is pretty much homogeneous throughout the bin, or at least for the most part it should be. But we can see already just from grabbing a few handfuls of this stuff that almost every handful has worms hanging out in it. So they've kind of made themselves at home, at least down through this middle section, from what I can tell. My hope is that the material is just as hospitable for them and drawing a crowd as elsewhere over here on the edges. I could already see down there there's worms hanging out down near the bottom. There's a good bit of moisture down in the bottom, but no standing liquid. Not that that would be a real big problem either, but it's usually not a good practice in most cases to have standing liquids inside of your bins. But there is a good degree of moisture in here. I think the material that we're observing out here on the edges is a little bit more representative of the state of the bin right now. Little signs of worm castings deposited throughout it. Down here in the middle, where things look a little bit further along, we don't want to get tricked into thinking that our bin is doing so good after only a week's time. All this casting material you find little concentrations of here and there. That's all just the stuff that the worms had been occupying previously when we scooped them out of their old home and brought them over. So I did actually include a good bit of native castings material that the worms were living in to make them feel comfortable when they first get introduced into here, so they can hang out in that for as long as they like before they venture out into the rest of the bin to make their way. But it does seem like the worms have not been deterred from fanning out into all sections of the bin, even out here on the edges, out in the corners, down low. I feel like I'm seeing a pretty good consistent number of worms everywhere I look. So this does look quite nice. The whole bin seems to be in terrific shape. I was just thinking here, you know, I mean, I'm not bound to sticking to my normal. This is funny. Look at these worms over here on the wall. Looks like they're like jet airplanes flying in formation, Skyriders or something. I don't know why, it just caught my eye. Thought I'd show those little guys crawling up the wall sort of in a little pattern. You can see another one crawling the wall over here. So a lot of times I should try to read the writing on the wall, and I guess that's the feedback I'm getting about this disruption I'm creating here. So maybe we don't want to keep agitating these little guys any further. Maybe it is a good idea at this point to get this feeding completed and let these little guys get back to work. So how's this for an idea? The coffee filter that came with the fresh coffee that I just bought down from the kitchen. This filter here is going to be used to show where we last fed. And we'll just use this old one as bedding. But where to feed is the question. That's why I wanted to bring that up, because instead of just doing the thing that I do everywhere else all the time, put the feeding down the middle, maybe we'll try a little something different here. Ooh, let's get these worms back into the system. I'm gonna do a little pocket feeding exercise here, which really just means you put the feeding into like a corner. The whole pocket analogy, I guess, is the idea that this might be like a billiard table, and the pockets on the billiard table are at the corners, as well as here on the sides. There's a couple pockets, but the pocket feeding is named that way, I believe, because of the billiard table metaphor. And And I guess we'll just sort of grab this upper right corner, or at least upper right corner from my perspective, and we'll position today's feeding into there. I've made a pretty good sized hole, as you can see, because I would like to put a good amount of stuff in there. So why don't we use some of these pieces of cardboard that sort of made their way into here, since they were part of the old system but didn't really have much of a purpose, since they were just sort of flanking the system out on the outer edges. I believe that this stuff would make a really nice foundation for this feeding. Just placing all of this old bedding type material that we found in the bin when we first arrived, and that'll put it to good use, put it right in the line of fire so that it immediately starts getting broken down by the system's inhabitants. And then I think I'm going to plop in all this mashed potato here. Hopefully we don't come back into this system in another week or so and find just a big pile of uneaten mashed potatoes. But there's always kind of that danger when you sort of step out of the bounds in terms of feeding your worm bins. And if you do feed your worm bins kind of oddball materials where the outcome is uncertain, you probably want to do so in fairly small quantities, because if the worms are going to reject it, you don't want to have a big pile of stuff that you need to clean up and extract. If they do away with it, then you can go full bore and feed much greater quantities of this stuff. But in the beginning, it's always best to test the waters and see what the worms like and don't like. More importantly, to determine what they don't like, so you can just avoid using this stuff in your worm bins. Figure out some other way to compost it or get rid of it. So the feeding here is already starting to take shape and occupy a good amount of space. So I'm just sort of squashing it down a little bit and mixing it. Now we've got little bits of bedding, we've got pieces of potato, we've got chunks of coffee, all kinds of things commingled already down on the bottom there. So I think before we sprinkle on what remains of the leftover coffee in our filter, I'm just going to reach into my little plastic bag here and grab some more food for them. I think a nice 2-handful portion seems realistic for a population of this size. It does seem like we've got a good 1,000 or more worms in here. I can't remember if we tried to come up with any sort of rough estimate of this bin's population. For a while there, I was turning to the viewers to provide me with their input on what they thought they saw, usually during the releases of my worms, so that you can use that as an opportunity to guesstimate how many worms occupy my systems. I don't think we did that in the case of this particular bin on this go around, so I don't believe we have an estimate for the size of the population in this bin, or at least not one that we collectively arrived at. I may have scribbled something into my spreadsheet, but I can't recall what that was. And then again, I could just be completely forgetting or mixing this one up with another system. Maybe we do have a population size estimate for this one. I'll have to check. But I think we're pretty close to buttoning up this feeding. Just thinking it would be kind of nice to come back in here with just another handful of nice pre-made aged bedding with which to cover up this delectable feeding for them. My newest thing nowadays has been to be really generous with bedding, and you would have to say that we probably applied almost as much, if not as much, bedding to this feeding zone as we added food. Between all those chunks of cardboard at the bottom, between that old used coffee filter, and now even more shredded paper and cardboard and whatnot on top, we've got ourselves a pretty nice feeding zone here. I like how this torn open coffee filter sort of hugs the corner, indicating to us where we fed this bin. All right, I get it. These little worms are really starting to not like me being here because they're all over the walls. So I think it's time to start putting things away here. We're more or less done with the task at hand. We've given our newest bin here, my 7-day-old European nightcrawler system, its first feeding. And from what I can tell, the system's in pretty nice shape. So we're just going to continue on as is, and it'll be interesting to come in here a week from now and see how those potatoes are doing, but we won't feed there next time. We'll feed in another corner the next time. And if it takes 2 weeks, takes 3 weeks, whatever amount of time it takes for those potatoes to actually get consumed by the worms, we'll actually be able to observe it over time, because it'll be, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 more feedings from now before we find ourselves back at that corner to apply that particular feedings portion. And by then we will probably expect to see very few, if any, leftovers from this feeding now. So it'll be fun to watch how some of these older feedings progress over time, because this is a really nice way to monitor the breakdown of the foods in your system. So I've got a whole bunch of stuff to return to the freezer here, and a couple things to clean up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go though, really quick, I want to say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.